there's only a handful of serial killers that we honestly know it was just by chance that they were caught and have unbelievable numbers attached to them when it comes to victim count. It's not just because they're serial killers that capture your interest. It's the fact that they're good at what they do and have a normal life, besides one element in their life that they're able to compartmentalize, which is murdering people. They're successful, they've achieved a beautiful life, they have a house, a wife, children, a nice car, they go on vacations, but all that while having a secret to themselves. No one else knows about it, not even the closest people to them. Gary Ridgway has a very interesting story throughout his career of being a serial killer, but what is most interesting, and honestly, to tell it in a fair detail, it has to be broken up into different parts. But the capture of Gary would have many different elements attached to it, even so much so that one of the biggest serial killers at the time in America would try to help the Green River Killer be caught, who at that time was not known to be Gary Ridgway. Bundy himself had just spent time in the same woods, driving up and down the same roads, kidnapping women, and still to these days, Ted and Gary's story cross lanes many times. It's sad and morbid to say, but it is the truth to say, Gary might be one of the best serial killers in North America that's ever been caught. His body count is staggering. He was good at taking people, disposing them, and moving in a fast way. But someone that seemed so gentle, so nice, so well put together, someone looking in, not knowing, just the person that Gary was thought to be. Most people would want him as a brother, a friend, a father, a husband, but Gary had a very dark addiction that would unravel itself in time. This is the killer Ted Bundy wanted to catch and didn't even know. He shared so many traits with him. This is the crossroads with Ted and Gary.
37 women are dead, 9 more still missing, and police have spent $10 million hunting the most deadly serial killer in American history.
Anyone saw a truck or a vehicle like this around the SeaTac Strip between 1982 and 1984, or just knows somebody who owns such a truck? It could be important information. Please call. You may be able to give us the one piece of information that we need.
In Seattle today, a man called the Green River Killer has finally confessed to murdering 48 women and girls, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history. His name is Gary Ridgway.
It's odd that two of the worst and most famous serial killers came from the same place in the United States. Gary Ridgway's front door is just 20 minutes away from where Ted Bundy lived and started taking his own victims from around the University of Washington. They drove the same roads, went to the same places, but hunted a different type of victim when it came to women. Their stories would run into each other many times, and they still do when bones pop up from time to time, and authorities not knowing if they belong to Gary or Ted. Gary would start his killing spree in 1982, shocking authorities in the area because they had just gotten rid of what they thought they would never have again, the world's most sadistic serial killer, Ted Bundy. Gary's victim list is simply just mind-blowing when you look at it. Many believe that he's killed over 200 women, and Gary simply just can't remember and doesn't disagree with it. Gary will go through 3 marriages in his life. His first 2 will end before he really starts the day-to-day, weekly serial killer lifestyle. As the second marriage ends in 1981, Gary is a bachelor for a little bit of time, divorced and gone through the court systems twice, living alone and having past anger from his childhood and 2 marriages. He's built up an anger towards women. With a wounded mind, Gary now left alone, wounded, and lusting for physical contact with women, wrapped around the element of violence towards them as well. This is the transformation that takes place in Gary's life. Gary's main time of murdering women would be when he was done with his second marriage, but in that time frame, Gary still has his son living with him off and on, sharing joint custody. People that know Gary speak nothing but praise for him, saying that he's an amazing father. But there is a story that would come out later on about Gary being a father, depicting the levels of his addiction. For some reason, Gary would admit to killing while having his son with him, Before Gary is married to his third and final wife, he's in the busiest moments of his life hunting for women. Like most serial killers, it takes up most of his time for normal elements in life that he has to do, apart from work, sleep, eating, seeing family. So with Gary having shared custody of his son, who was still under 5 at this moment, Gary was asked simply, did he ever pick up anybody when he had his boy with him in his truck? Gary just came clean and said yes. He went into detail, who, what, and where. Gary in his truck with his son were driving when Gary said he simply saw an opportunity in front of him that he couldn't resist. He pulled over to a young lady that was hitchhiking. Gary would roll down the window asking where she was going. Gary looking clean cut and having his son in the truck with him. Who in a million years would have thought that they were getting in a car with someone that was about to strangle them to death? The young lady gets in Gary's truck, his son in the middle seat, close to Gary. Gary says he just drives off, but soon in the wrong direction. The girl starts asking questions. Gary goes to a random location, no one around, gets out of the truck, and tells the young lady to get out too. Somewhere between the truck, Gary's son, and maybe not out of sight of his son's eyes or ears, he hits and strangles the young girl and assaults her. Gary hops back in his vehicle and drives off with his son. It's really one of the first recorded murders where a serial killer admits to killing a person while having their child with them. How Gary would meet his wife in the later form of his life. He attends church and pops in and out of single groups for older people, mostly divorced people, like Gary himself. He goes on dates, but nothing is ever said that Gary was inappropriate. It was quite the opposite. Gary was known to be a gentleman in his community of people around him. A father, single, great job, house, vehicles, church going, loved as a good friend by men and women. It would be Gary's MO, really, for most of his life when people talk about him, still today. Ted Bundy's taste in victims was completely different than Gary's. Gary was simply just after a female body. Attraction helped, but it seemed to be the soul more that Gary wanted. Gary enjoyed the process of death, simple, fast, and effective, choking his victims with his own hands. He tried other means of death for moments, but his hands around the throat was simply what he lusted for. A large amount of Gary's victims were women of the night, or runaways, and just women hitchhiking, but all of them were down on their luck or needing something, and Gary used it to his advantage. A great deal of Gary's victims were found unspoiled from the weather, time, or animals. The trees and moss and cold air or hot air, bugs that lay in the ground or in the air, or water from the rivers, never completely got rid of the bodies by the time some of them were found. So the evidence of what Gary did to them was still there to be seen in the autopsy. But Ted was spoiled to the taste of what he developed with his victims. His victims were clean young women or girls, not even 15 yet. They were in college or ungraduated, came from good homes with good families that kept up with them, where they were, who they were with. Mostly none, if any, of Ted's victims. They didn't need anything from him. They never asked for his help. It was simply the opposite. Ted approached them, asking for their help, and simply in good conscience, they helped to their own death. Unlike Gary, we know that Ted loved the brutality of torture and fear, the hunt, the feel and smell of blood that filled the air as he beat and choked his victims. Ted was vicious, like a hyena. Gary was simple. Ted only had a handful of his victims be found, intact, the ones that had been kidnapped and taken for a day or so, for Ted to have his way with them. Their bodies were left in the cold snow, freezing. Ted was brutal. Most of the time he beat his victim over the head, knocking their jaw out, busting out their teeth, knocking them unconscious, if not death, using a rock or a crowbar, while he assaulted them over and over and choking them with his bare hands at the same time. We know that when Ted assaulted his victims, from the bodies that were recovered, he would assault them rectally, causing mass bleeding while strangling them at the same time. It was an unhuman, horrific element that Ted did to his victims. The worse it was, the more he enjoyed it. He was cruel, and he knew it. Ted also went through a great length to find his victims, the one that he wanted, stalking them, watching them for days, weeks, sometimes months, and even, we know, making small relationships with them. Ted would drive hundreds of miles from his home to other cities around where he lived. Gary was able to achieve the life of stability to where he could hide his obsession with murder from everyone. Gary was able to murder so many people because he had a life that displayed itself in the background as a normal picture that everyone just looked over. In so many ways, Gary's life looked like a fairy tale story to where Gary was the hero. It's well known and documented that many women wanted to be with Gary, where they would come into contact with his life, whether it be his church, work, family, a good-looking single dad with a great job, home, vehicles. It was an amazing alibi for Gary. Gary was also dependable and never left home for days at a time. In many ways, Gary was the perfect husband and dad. He loved his family, never raised a hand to his wife or child. He just happened to be a serial killer. It's sad to say, but it was Gary's victims that kept him under radar. Ted went after beauty queens, and the news loved it. But again, what separated Ted and Gary with their own lives was that Gary was independent, where his job allowed him to not need girlfriends to take care of him or family. He was able to support himself, have his home, cars, nor did Gary have to steal for what he wanted. It was essentially the perfect setup for a serial killer. As Gary did know about Ted and have followed his own story, essentially the two were neighbors, and more than likely had been in close range of each other at some point in time growing up. When it comes down to statistics, it seems impossible that two of the world's most famous serial killers could live right next to each other, and many of their victims had moments of passing by each other, their friends, their family, or someone knew someone of a victim from Gary or Ted. The number of victims for Gary and Ted combined, it's well over 100, which equates well over to 1,000 people, from friends, family, day-to-day acquaintances. When one person dies, it affects many, but this went on for over a decade with Ted and Gary, affecting their community. Ted was born in 1946, November 24th of that year. Gary was born the 18th of February, 1949. Gary, oddly born in Salt Lake City, Utah, where Ted would have his moment of kidnapping women in the city and start attending school there. Ted and Gary were from the boomer generation, a new generation that survived the war and now having large amounts of children. As Ted had come to an end of kidnapping and murdering women in the late 70s, Gary was just getting started in the early 80s. We know much more about Gary's victims, their last moments, than we do Ted, for the sole reason that Gary immediately confessed to his murders, not hiding much, and Ted, on the other hand, pleading his innocence all the way through 2 trials, 2 different murder cases, multiple victims, and sitting on death row for 10 years, until just a few days before his death, he confessed, trying to save his own life. Gary had a strong hatred for his mother, having thoughts of taking her life and assaulting her. He admits much of this detail to why he hated her, Gary being the victim in the moments that he talks about with his mother early in his childhood, saying that his mother belittled him, openly making fun of him. Gary said it destroyed him as a child and building a deep anger for his mother and essentially women. Gary knows that it was a huge element when lust met the overwhelming motivation to assault women, and no doubt this helps explain why Gary's victims are so different from race, age, looks. Gary was simply just looking for a woman most of the time. It wasn't just about the assault, it was about letting out the anger. Ted was entirely different. Ted, who grew up thinking his mother was his sister for much of his younger life, but discovering one day that in fact his sister was his mother. Ted says it was a shattering moment for him in his life, not knowing really how to cope with it. It was weird. We know admittedly that Ted said he did love his mother and was essentially very close to her for his whole life, even while he was in prison. Even before Ted was executed, he talked to his mother on the phone that night, telling her how much he loved her and that he was so sorry for everything that he had done, admitting the gravity of what he had done and his crimes. But Ted was more of the mama's boy, never giving any indication that his mother hurt him, assaulted him. There's no record of it, and Ted has always spoken highly against it. But at the same time, as Ted was close to his mother and they had an affectionate relationship, Gary's was entirely different. These elements in no doubt were huge functions in their personalities, that showed how they built relationships and interacted with women. Ted was amazing talking to women, able to manipulate, lie, and control the narrative, the theme of what his life was that day. He was the life of the party, a big personality, clean-cut, good-looking, smart, intelligent, could talk about anything, make the conversation stir around him and what he knew about it. It was Ted's main weapon that he used to lure any kind of person, and why he fooled everyone in his life for so long, even essentially to the end. We know that Gary was reserved, quiet, and was the person in the corner of the room, never making a loud interruption. This is more than not why Gary's victims were in a position of needing something from him, money, a ride. Gary wasn't smooth like Ted when it came to fishing for any kind of person he wanted. Gary wasn't able, nor did he ever show the tricks that Ted did. When you look into both Gary and Ted's childhood, as children, roaming the woods and having friends around the neighborhood, this is where simple stories of cruelty come out. With Ted in particular, there's one story of where it's said that Ted would hurt a cat, making it scream. But there's only one story of this with Ted and animals. With Ted's childhood, there was more weird behavior than not. Running away, hiding, putting knives in beds, more psychological games than not, which would play a huge part in Ted's life later on. Trickery, fooling people, hiding. On the other side of the coin, Gary was more than willing to talk of the torture he put on small and helpless neighborhood pets or wild animals that he found in the woods. The big element that this alludes to is the anger of both men that they had in their childhood. Gary showing much more anger, even at a very young age. Ted was in the Boy Scouts and well educated, in school, had a mother and father, brothers, sisters. He was taught well. He was raised to be a gentleman, say yes ma'am, no sir, hold doors. Essentially, Ted's parents raised him right. But we know Gary was raised nothing like Ted. The elements of his life were completely different than what Ted experienced. Gary did what he could in education and simply went into a blue-collar job, making a good life for himself. The years that Ted was on death row, he was asked about the Green River Killer, telling Ted about the victims, how they were found, where they were found, age, race, trying to see if Ted could give any clues to why, who the Green River Killer was at the time. Ted loved it. He wanted more. He asked to see crime scene photos, but he never was allowed that much. In the end, Ted really never gave much insight to the case, really just talked about himself in the third person, if he were a killer. It would be over a decade until Gary was arrested and made public that he was the Green River Killer, and Ted had already left this world over a decade ago at that point. Ted lost his life in the electric chair in 1989 due to not taking plea deals that he was begged to take several years beforehand. To save his own life, he was given the option, but his narcissism and wild confidence that he could fool everyone cost him his life. And Ted was told after a decade of being on death row that he was to die in so many days, to which Ted started confessing to try to save his life. But the book had ran out of pages and Ted's time was up. Gary had no arrogance, no pride in himself, or really his murders. Gary simply confessed and knew he couldn't talk his way out of it. The evidence on him was just too good, and he knew he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, taking a plea deal. There more than likely will never be a pair like Ted and Gary once again, at least living right next to each other. Not in this new world that both men would have trouble pulling their tricks in today. A short moment in history where Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway were more than likely right beside each other at times, with the same desires, same secrets, and eventually knowing who the other one was, but never meeting, but living just miles apart from each other. The wild story of Ted and Gary.